A poor mechanic fixes a young nurse's car for free, unaware she was hiding a secret that would change both their lives forever. Hello, viewer. Thanks for joining us. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments, along with the city you're watching from. Now let's continue with the story. The morning sky was drenched in a relentless downpour, transforming the two-lane country road into a glistening ribbon of asphalt. Caleb Mills, 35 years old and standing over 6 feet tall, kept one hand on the hood of the old sedan he'd just pulled up behind. Rain hammered against his worn denim jacket, droplets cascading from the brim of his baseball cap. Even so, he leaned forward without hesitation, peering at the engine steaming beneath a thin veil of hot mist. On the driver's side of the stranded vehicle stood Sophie Donovan, a slight woman of 32 with brown, loosely wavy hair now plastered to her cheeks by the rain. Her big, expressive eyes shone with both worry and a hint of relief as she watched Caleb examine the overheated engine. She wore simple scrubs under a light jacket, a choice that clearly hadn't anticipated such a storm. Her face revealed the anxiety of someone who desperately needed to be somewhere, fast. "I'm really sorry," Sophie began, her voice slightly trembling. "I was on my way to the hospital for my first day of work. The temperature gauge spiked out of nowhere, and now it won't start at all." Caleb gave her a reassuring nod, water dripping off his brow. "Don't worry about it, ma'am. I see this a lot when folks drive through these back roads. Radiator hose must have given out, or maybe it's low coolant causing an overheat." His tone was comforting, though he spoke in short, practical phrases. It was his way, never too many words, but always kind. They stood together in the downpour for a moment, the endless patter of rain, an oddly intimate backdrop to their brief conversation. Sophie explained how she had recently moved to this small town in rural Pennsylvania, though she didn't specify exactly why. And Caleb, focusing on the car's engine, just listened, nodding at the right moments. "I can fix this here, but it's best we tow it to my buddy's shop. I work at a small roadside garage about 3 miles back," he said, glancing at Sophie to gauge her reaction. "We can get you sorted and on your way." Her gaze flickered with gratitude. The day had been off to a rough start, but she could see genuine decency in this tall, broad-shouldered mechanic whose worn jeans and scuffed boots told a story of honest, hard work. She hesitated only a second before agreeing. After all, she was already behind schedule. A passing pickup truck slowed, its driver recognizing Caleb and rolling down a window to shout a quick greeting. "Need help, Mills?" Caleb shook his head politely, hollering back that he had it under control. Within minutes, he had rigged a makeshift fix to cool the engine. Sophie, nearly soaked through, stood by, her arms hugging her own shoulders for warmth. When Caleb finished tightening a clamp, he wiped his hands on a rag from his back pocket. "Try turning the ignition now," he suggested, stepping aside. The car sputtered but eventually roared to life, releasing another plume of steam from under the hood. Sophie's face lit up in relief. She immediately reached for her wallet. "How much do I owe you? I mean, I can't thank you enough." Her voice was urgent, sincere, as though she feared she might insult him by not offering payment. Caleb's face hardened just a bit, not out of anger, but from that familiar discomfort that came whenever someone tried to pay him for a roadside kindness. Shaking his head, he answered simply, "No charge. You needed help, that's all." Sophie was momentarily speechless. It wasn't often that she encountered people who did something so generous without expecting anything in return. She insisted he at least take something to cover his time, but he refused again, adjusting the brim of his cap with a shy smile. Before she could argue further, he offered an understated grin and stepped back. "You should be on your way," he said gently. Their eyes met, his thoughtful and a bit weary, hers filled with gratitude and curiosity. A flicker of connection passed between them, quick as a flash of lightning across the sky. "Thank you," Sophie managed, her heart pounding with a curious mix of relief and wonder. "I promise I'll find a way to return the favor." Caleb only nodded, then turned to secure his tools. The rain showed no signs of letting up, but somehow, in that fleeting exchange, a warm spark had ignited between two strangers. Sophie drove off, glancing in the rearview mirror at Caleb standing by his pickup, water streaming off his shoulders. She had no idea that, come what may, their paths were now set on a collision course towards something far more meaningful than a simple car repair in a rainstorm. The following morning arrived grey and damp, with puddles lingering along the roads. Caleb Mills wiped condensation off the office window in the small roadside garage where he worked. Bobby Coleman, 40 years old, burly, and always ready with a wisecrack, brought Caleb a steaming cup of coffee. "Is this about the woman you helped yesterday?" Bobby teased, noticing Caleb's distant stare. "I can practically see gears turning in that head of yours." Caleb shrugged non-committally. "She was just in a tough spot. I'd have done the same for anyone." Yet his gaze kept drifting outside, as if expecting Sophie's car to roll up at any moment. Meanwhile, Sophie Donovan was having her own challenging morning. She hurried through the bustling corridors of the local hospital, where white fluorescent lights illuminated every anxious face. She was officially late for her first day, thanks to the rain and her roadside misadventure. Staff members paused to glance at her as she introduced herself as a new nurse. Some offered polite greetings, while others seemed skeptical of the newcomer who wasn't off to the best start. Once she'd settled into a cramped locker room, Sophie flipped through her phone, searching for any messages about orientation or a welcome briefing. Instead, her screen lit up with an incoming call she instantly recognized. Stepping into a quiet hallway, she answered, trying to keep her voice steady. "Hello, Dad," she whispered, glancing over her shoulder. "Yes, I'm here. No, I won't be late tomorrow." "Yes, I know how important impressions are." Sophie's tone balanced respect with a strain of exasperation. She ended the call with a curt, "I'll make you proud," then tucked the phone away, a worried crease forming between her brows. Back at the garage, Caleb and Bobby inspected a battered SUV up on the lift. But as they worked, Caleb recounted the story of fixing Sophie's car under the storm. Bobby picked up on the details. "Funny how you're still talking about that little incident," he remarked with a knowing grin. "Most times, you'd help somebody and move on without a second thought." Caleb bristled slightly, though he knew Bobby meant no harm. "She just struck me as different," he conceded, not sure why. Maybe she was extra grateful, or maybe I was just too soaked to think straight. He tried to sound indifferent, but there was a spark behind his words. Meanwhile, Sophie's day inside the hospital proved both hectic and eye-opening. During an orientation tour, she overheard nurses gossiping about how the hospital had recently been acquired by a new owner, someone rumored to be sharp, business-minded, and intent on big changes. Sophie bit her lip, resisting the urge to comment. She wondered if anyone already suspected she might be that owner's daughter. Although she was determined to succeed on her own merits, the fear of her true identity coming to light sooner than she'd like weighed heavily on her. After her shift, Sophie retreated to a quiet corner near the nurses' station. She scrolled through her contacts until she reached Caleb's name, which she'd saved after finding his business card tucked next to the vehicle registration in her glove compartment. A thought danced in her mind. Should she call to say thank you again? Maybe find some excuse to drop by the garage. She felt a flicker of anticipation, but then turned off the screen, reminding herself she hardly knew him. Simultaneously, across town, Caleb was cleaning up at the garage. He found himself wondering about that nurse and what had brought her to their small community. Usually, he was content with a steady routine, fixing vehicles, chatting with neighbors, and heading home to a modest place he called his own. But now, a small shift had occurred inside him, an undercurrent of curiosity he couldn't quite ignore. Just as he closed the shop for the day, Bobby slapped a newspaper into his hand, pointing to a small blurb about a grand charity event the hospital was planning. "Reckon we'll be seeing that new nurse there?" Bobby asked. Caleb only shrugged, but inwardly he felt that odd little twist of anticipation once more. He had no idea what was coming, yet a subtle feeling told him their paths would cross again, possibly sooner than he expected. The charity event announced in the local paper started to loom in everyone's mind. Slated for the following weekend, it promised free medical screenings, a fundraising raffle, and a community barbecue. The hospital's new leadership was intent on making a splash, though few residents understood just how closely Sophie Donovan was tied to it all. Caleb Mills sat on a wooden stool in the corner of the garage, an outdated magazine open on his lap. He wasn't really reading. Instead, he pictured Sophie, hair damp from the rain, her eyes anxious yet appreciative. There was a strange push and pull within him. Part of him wanted to see her again, but another part reminded him that tangling up his quiet life with someone he barely knew could mean drama he didn't need. Bobby Coleman clanked his toolbox shut. "So, are you actually going to that hospital event?" he asked, raising a brow. "They want volunteers to do light repairs, bikes, wheelchairs, that kind of thing. You'd be perfect for it." Caleb exhaled, the memory of Sophie's warm smile nudging him. "I don't know, man. The last time I volunteered at a big community thing, I ended up overshadowed by slick sponsors and logos on every tent." He recalled feeling out of place amidst corporate booths and glossy banners. "I like helping, but not as some kind of show." Bobby nodded, understanding but still pressed gently. "You might be needed, and it's for a good cause. Could be a chance to break out of your routine, too." Meanwhile, at the hospital, Sophie hovered by a row of lockers, confiding in Margaret Blake, a seasoned nurse in her early 50s, with a gentle smile and a practical approach to life. Margaret noticed Sophie's fidgety hands and nervous glances down the hallway. "Something on your mind, honey?" Margaret asked, adjusting the stethoscope around her neck. "First days are always tough, but you seem more unsettled than most newbies." Sophie lowered her voice. "They want me front and center at that charity event. I'm worried. People don't really know who I am or who my father is." Her heart clenched at the thought. She didn't want to become the subject of office gossip any sooner than necessary. Margaret gave her a comforting pat on the shoulder. "If you're there just to help folks, then let that be enough. You don't owe everyone your life story on day one." Sophie's anxiety, however, went beyond her father's identity. She couldn't stop replaying the sight of Caleb in the rain, his quiet strength and selflessness. She'd promised him she would find a way to repay his kindness, but so far she hadn't mustered the courage to reach out. Truth was, the idea of seeing him again both excited and scared her. She worried that once he discovered who she was, a Donovan, he might think she had hidden it on purpose. Early that evening, Sophie contemplated calling Caleb. Her phone felt heavy in her hand. Would he even want to hear from her? With a frustrated sigh, she set the phone aside and focused on tomorrow's shift schedule, burying herself in routine tasks. Across town, Caleb rummaged through a dusty box of old letters and snapshots in his modest living room. A photo of him and his late father at the garage's opening day caught his eye. His father's unwavering generosity, he never turned away anyone who needed help, had been etched into Caleb's heart. Yet he also recalled the times his father's kind nature was taken advantage of by wealthier folks who saw them as nothing more than cheap labor. The memory stung, fueling Caleb's reluctance to attend events tied to big donors or potential exploitation. Still, an image of Sophie's sincere gratitude tugged at him. He found himself wanting to believe she was different, that she was drawn to genuinely making a difference in people's lives. But doubt lingered. Would she belong to that world that never truly sees people like him? He closed the box and rubbed the back of his neck. The hospital had asked if he would provide free tune-ups on lawnmowers, wheelchairs, and other small equipment at the charity festival. He was on the fence, uncertain if he could face the subtle sense of inferiority that always snuck up on him in such settings. Neither Sophie nor Caleb realized how soon they would find themselves in the same crowded, bustling community event, forced to confront both each other and the uncertainties they were trying to escape. Thunderhead still lingered on the horizon, as if reflecting the tension building in Sophie Donovan's life. She leaned against the wall by the hospital's main entrance, her phone pressed to her ear. The voice on the other end, firm, authoritative, belonged to her father, Dr. Richard Donovan. "Sophie, the event's in a few days," he reminded, impatience creeping into his tone. "We need a flawless presentation, so please don't let this turn into a mess. I've invested heavily in this hospital, and our family name is on the line." Her shoulders tensed. "Dad, I'm fully aware. I'll be there. Just let me handle the nursing side, okay? I'm not comfortable making big speeches about expansions or finances." She tried to steady her voice, sensing his disapproval even through the phone. Dr. Donovan sighed. "Fine. But remember, perception is everything. The community needs to see the hospital as a positive force, and you're part of that image." He ended the call abruptly, leaving Sophie feeling both resentful and guilty. By late afternoon, she was assisting with patients in the emergency department. Margaret Blake paused beside her with a gentle smile. "You look like a woman under a ton of pressure. Everything all right?" Sophie shrugged, forcing a smile. "Yes, just family stuff. My father can be intense, and I'm trying to make it on my own here." Margaret nodded sympathetically, but didn't pry further. Sophie was grateful for that simple kindness. She felt increasingly torn between her personal goals and the looming shadow her father's ambitions cast. On the opposite side of town, Caleb Mills also found himself weighed down by outside pressures. The small roadside garage was busier than usual, and he was already 2 vehicles behind schedule. A local farmer's tractor engine had blown out unexpectedly, and a neighbor's pickup needed urgent transmission work. All while the hospital's representatives kept leaving polite but persistent voicemails asking if Caleb had decided to volunteer at the charity event. "It's not that I don't want to help," he muttered, deleting another message. "I just don't want to get tangled in all that corporate nonsense." Bobby, adjusting his cap, overheard. "I get it, but maybe you're painting it all with the same brush. Could be this event isn't just for show. You heard about that nurse, right? She's apparently the real deal, cares about folks." He arched a brow, obviously hinting at Sophie. Caleb didn't respond, but his mind went back to that rainy roadside. He couldn't deny she seemed genuinely kind and down to earth, which made the idea of seeing her again quietly appealing. Yet the fear of stepping into a world where he didn't feel he belonged held him back. Evening settled, and Sophie clocked out, her feet aching from hours on the go. As she passed the hospital's administrative hallway, she spotted a new poster featuring her father's photograph, next to bold letters announcing Hospital Expansion Initiative. Plans were well underway for major renovations, maybe more than the community realized. Her gut twisted. She knew expansions often meant big changes, and not always in ways that benefited everyone. She remembered hearing locals talk about how small businesses could be forced to relocate if the hospital's property acquisitions spread too far. Could it affect the little garage where Caleb worked? The thought unsettled her more than she cared to admit. The night sky was streaked with fading purple light when she finally headed home. She felt torn in multiple directions, her father's expectations, the community's needs, and her own growing attachment to the place, and possibly to a certain mechanic. She couldn't quite articulate why she was drawn to Caleb's steady presence, but something about his honest labor and quiet generosity resonated deeply within her. Meanwhile, Caleb locked up the garage, flipping off the lights before stepping into the twilight. He stared at the phone number he'd jotted down for Sophie, written on a small, oil-stained receipt. He tucked it back into his wallet, wrestling with a wave of uncertainty. Maybe volunteering at the event would allow him to see her again, see how she really operated within that hospital system. Yet part of him questioned if he could handle the potential disappointment of realizing she was far out of his league. As the sky darkened, both Sophie and Caleb found themselves in quiet corners of their respective homes, contemplating the same event that loomed just days away. A gathering meant to unify the town, but one that might expose every secret and insecurity they had tried to keep hidden. Sophie woke to the buzz of her phone vibrating on the nightstand. She rubbed her eyes, heart fluttering with apprehension. The charity event was tomorrow, and a flurry of last-minute updates from the hospital staff flooded her notifications. With a resigned sigh, she pushed the covers aside and got ready for the day, pulling on a comfortable sweater and jeans. Although her father might have preferred her in something more polished, she craved a slice of normalcy, just one morning to feel like herself. By mid-morning, Sophie found a moment of refuge in the hospital cafeteria, sipping lukewarm coffee. Margaret joined her, lowering herself into a chair with a tired smile. "Feeling ready for the big show tomorrow?" the older nurse asked gently. "Honestly," Sophie responded, fiddling with the coffee cup lid, "not really. I know I have to be there and I want to help, but I can't shake the nerves. And..." She paused, picking her words. "There's someone I met. I keep wondering if he'll show up." Margaret's eyes sparkled. "Oh, someone from around here?" Sophie nodded, cheeks warming. "He's a mechanic named Caleb Mills. He helped me when my car broke down on that stormy day. He refused to take any payment. And, well, he's different, quiet, really genuine." She took a breath. "But I'm afraid if he learns who my father is, it'll change how he sees me." Margaret reached over and patted Sophie's hand. "People can surprise you, dear, and it sounds like you two already share a sense of kindness." Meanwhile, Caleb was pacing the length of the garage's office, the volunteer sign-up form resting on the desk. He'd spent half the morning debating whether to accept the hospital's invitation to do small repairs during the event. Bobby, leaning against the doorway, finally piped up, "You know you want to go, so why not stop agonizing? You've always cared about folks in this town." Caleb paused, exhaling. "Yeah, but what if it's all politics, and I'm just some show pony in the corner? I don't want to be used, Bobby." Bobby's grin softened. "Let's say it is about show for some folks. But for others, like that nurse you can't stop thinking about, maybe it's about genuinely helping. Don't punish them because of a few big shots who might have fancy agendas." After a moment of silence, Caleb finally scribbled his name on the form. "All right, I'll do it," he declared, though uncertainty still gripped him. But a small flicker of hope tugged at his chest. Perhaps he would cross paths with Sophie again, and maybe that wouldn't be such a bad thing. That evening, the entire town buzzed with preparations for the festival-like event. Local shops donated gift baskets for raffles. High school students painted signs, and a family-run bakery volunteered trays of cookies. Even the mayor planned to attend. Flyers were posted all over, announcing free health screenings and a day of community fun. In her modest apartment, Sophie folded a freshly laundered set of scrubs she planned to wear in the triage station. Her heart pounded whenever she imagined encountering Caleb among the volunteers. Was she being silly to hope he'd show up? Possibly, but the idea that he might be there, working side by side with her, sparked an unexpected thrill. Elsewhere, Caleb closed the garage early to gather tools he'd take for on-site repairs, a small set of wrenches, a couple of spare parts, and a first aid kit of mechanical odds and ends. Each time he picked up a new tool, he reminded himself that this was a community effort and that his involvement could make a difference. A quiet voice in the back of his mind whispered about Sophie, about the genuine smile that had lingered even in the pouring rain. Neither of them knew exactly what the next day would bring, only that in stepping outside their comfort zones, they risked far more than embarrassment. They risked confronting hidden truths and facing questions of belonging, self-worth, and trust. And with each passing hour, it became clearer that this charity event wasn't just a local gathering. It was the threshold they both had been too timid to cross, until now. Saturday dawned crisp and bright, with the charity event just hours away. Sophie Donovan stood in the hospital's nearly empty break room, her mind racing through a mental checklist of tasks. She was supposed to oversee basic health screenings, blood pressure checks, glucose tests, yet her thoughts drifted to Caleb Mills more often than she cared to admit. She wondered if he would show up to fix all those bicycles and broken wheelchairs the event planners had been fretting about. Margaret Blake, the 50-year-old head nurse with a comforting, motherly air, entered and placed a gentle hand on Sophie's shoulder. "You're anxious," she observed softly, handing her a styrofoam cup of tea. "But it helps to remember why we do these things." Sophie sipped the tea and offered a small, wry smile. "I'm just hoping everything goes smoothly. My father wants this event to shine a light on the hospital's new direction, and he's not exactly patient with obstacles." Margaret nodded in understanding, then steered Sophie to a pair of chairs near the windows. They both sat. Through the glass, a slice of morning sunshine cast long beams across the linoleum floor. "There's a story I want to tell you," Margaret began. "Years ago, I was a traveling nurse, hopping from one state to another, not sure where I belonged. I had dreams of making a big difference, but fear and self-doubt kept me moving too often to root myself anywhere." Sophie leaned forward, genuinely curious. Margaret's warmth was impossible to ignore, and it felt good to listen rather than worry. "What changed?" she asked quietly. A soft chuckle escaped Margaret's lips. "I met a woman who reminded me that sometimes our value isn't about grand gestures, but about consistently showing up for people. She taught me that the simplest acts of kindness can do more than we imagine. I settled in this town a couple decades ago and never looked back." They fell silent for a moment. Sophie's eyes drifted to her folded hands. "I guess I'm trying to do something similar. I want to stand on my own, not just as my father's daughter, but prove my worth as a nurse. Yet I'm terrified of letting folks down or seeming like a fraud." Margaret reached over, giving Sophie's hands a comforting squeeze. "You have good instincts and a big heart. Trust that, and if you find yourself leaning on someone now and then, that's okay." Meanwhile, across town, Caleb was at home, carefully assembling a small box of spare parts. Socket wrenches, bolts, a couple of extra tubes for bike tires. It was everything he'd need to assist at the event. A part of him still felt unsure, a slight knot twisting in his stomach whenever he pictured milling around crowds under hospital tents. But he'd already committed. That morning, as he prepared, an old memory surfaced. Caleb's father had been a gentle giant of a man, known for rescuing folks stranded by flat tires or broken engines without charging a dime. When Caleb was 19, he'd once asked his father why he gave away so much of his time and skill. The older man had simply said, "Everybody needs somebody sometimes, son. Doesn't matter if they can pay you or not. If you do what's right, the rest will figure itself out." Caleb paused in the middle of gathering his tools, letting out a steady breath. He still believed in that principle: help whenever you can, no matter who's on the receiving end. Maybe the hospital event was a chance to honor those values on a bigger stage. Yet a nagging doubt lingered. Dr. Donovan's name was plastered all over the promotional materials, and Caleb had heard enough rumors about the hospital expansion to sense potential conflict. Could helping them undermine the small businesses in town? Nevertheless, he decided to trust his instincts. The memory of Sophie's sincere gratitude under that pouring rain reminded him that not everyone was out to exploit kindness. Perhaps this event could reveal a different side of the hospital and give him the opportunity to know Sophie better. With the morning sun growing warmer, Margaret and Sophie wrapped up their quiet talk at the hospital while Caleb loaded the last of his tools into his truck. Each carried the encouragement and wisdom they'd gathered over the years. And although neither Sophie nor Caleb consciously realized it, they both possessed the kind of generosity and grit that could make this day more than just a public relations affair. Something deeper, something transformative, was taking shape, fueled by shared resolve and the simple, powerful willingness to do good. Early morning sunlight cast a gentle glow as Sophie stepped out of her modest rental house. The day of the charity event had finally arrived. She carried 2 tote bags, one with medical supplies, the other with personal items like a water bottle and a light jacket. She paused on the front porch, inhaling the crisp air laced with the scent of dew-soaked grass. Despite her nerves, there was also a tingle of excitement coursing through her. By the time she reached the hospital parking lot, volunteers were already bustling about, unloading tables and crates of promotional materials. Sophie jumped in, helping arrange the triage station where she and a couple of other nurses would do blood pressure checks and basic evaluations. Now and then, she'd catch a glimpse of the event posters featuring her father's name and photo, feeling that familiar knot of pressure tighten in her chest. Across town, Caleb did a final check of the garage before locking up. Bobby Coleman walked up, arms folded, wearing a grin. "You're really doing this," Bobby said, patting Caleb on the back. "I didn't expect to see you volunteering under the hospital's banner." Caleb turned the key in the lock and frowned slightly. "I'm still not sure how I feel about all this, but folks keep saying it's for a good cause, and I promise to help repair bikes and such." He stepped back, gazing at the faded sign above the garage door as though he were saying goodbye to more than just a building for the day. This place was his haven, where everything felt under control. Stepping out into a public event, and especially one tied to big sponsors, felt like venturing onto uncertain ground. Bobby gave a supportive nod. "Well, I'll swing by later with the family. Let's see what this hospital crowd's all about." As Caleb drove toward the open field near the local park, the site of the day's festivities, he observed vendors setting up colorful tents. Groups of teenagers hoisted bright balloons around a central stage, and an older couple arranged homemade crafts on folding tables. Caleb parked his truck in a designated volunteer area, feeling the first stirrings of genuine anticipation. Perhaps he'd find Sophie, or at least learn a bit more about her world. Meanwhile, at the hospital's triage tent, Sophie noticed a small sign that read, "Complimentary Repairs, Caleb Mills, Mechanic," standing beside a row of battered wheelchairs and a stack of bicycles. Her pulse sped up momentarily. Even though she was supposed to be focused on finalizing the blood pressure station, she couldn't help scanning the sea of faces for a glimpse of him. Margaret soon arrived, wearing a cheerful expression. "We've got folks lining up for checkups already," she announced. "Try not to worry too much, dear. Today's about helping people." Sophie nodded, adjusting her stethoscope. Despite Margaret's reassurance, she could feel her anxiety fluttering in her stomach. The sight of her father walking across the lawn, flanked by a few well-dressed hospital board members, only heightened her nerves. She was determined to maintain a low profile, staying in her nurse's role rather than stepping into any spotlight. Caleb's truck rumbled a little as he pulled around to the designated repair station. A coordinator greeted him warmly, directing him to a corner where various broken items waited. He hopped out, carefully unloading his kit. The buzz of chatter and distant live music created a lively backdrop. This was a whole new environment for him. Kids darting around with balloon animals, an announcer testing a microphone. He had to admit it felt good to see the town come together for something positive. Sophie finished arranging bandages and gloves, then looked up in time to see Caleb, tall, strong-build, wearing a simple grey t-shirt and jeans, stooping beside a wheelchair. He appeared fully absorbed, examining the front wheel that kept catching on the frame. Her heart gave a small, involuntary leap at the sight of him actually here, in her orbit again. With that unspoken acknowledgement of each other's presence, Sophie and Caleb took their first steps away from their comfortable corners of the world. The event might still be a swirl of unknowns, but they were here, ready, or almost ready, to meet whatever came next. There was no telling how their lives would shift by the day's end, but for better or worse, they'd both parted ways with their old sense of routine, stepping forward into something neither could quite name yet. A warm breeze carried the scent of fried dough and grilled hot dogs through the sprawling festival grounds, where colorful pennants flapped overhead. Families strolled between booths offering face painting, homemade crafts, and local produce. At the heart of it all, a large banner read Community Health and Charity Day, sponsored by the hospital. Caleb Mills found himself pleasantly surprised by the cheerful vibe. This was nothing like the stiff, corporate affair he had imagined. He'd set up his repair station under a small canopy near the triage tent. Within minutes, he had already fixed a teenager's bicycle chain and tightened some wheelchair brakes for an elderly gentleman. Onlookers occasionally paused to watch his skilled hands at work. Caleb's strong forearms and focused gaze made him appear every bit the dedicated craftsman. Each sincere thank you he received reminded him why he'd come. Only a short distance away, Sophie Donovan busied herself at a makeshift desk for blood pressure screenings. Clad in her scrubs, she projected a calm, professional air as she greeted each visitor with a reassuring smile. Though her mind raced with all sorts of concerns, particularly about her father's looming presence somewhere in the crowd, her training kicked in, and she guided each patient smoothly through the process. In the lulls, she found herself glancing Caleb's way, watching him intently adjust a wrench or chat briefly with someone. There was something disarmingly genuine about his manner. Round midday, a local band started playing folksy tunes on a small stage in the center of the park, adding to the festive atmosphere. Margaret wandered between the triage station and the nearby booths, ensuring everything ran smoothly. Occasionally, she'd catch Sophie stealing a glimpse toward the repair canopy and chuckled quietly to herself. At one point, fate intervened in the form of a broken stroller. A flustered mother, juggling a cranky toddler and a diaper bag, approached Sophie's station by mistake. "I'm sorry, but do you know if there's anyone here who can fix this wobbly wheel?" the woman asked, a note of desperation in her voice. Sophie smiled, gently pointing across the grass. "Yes, right over there. Caleb Mills can help. He's the best at that sort of thing." The mother thanked her and headed off. Sophie hesitated, then seized the moment to request a short break. Her colleague took over the blood pressure checks, and she walked slowly across the field, weaving through the crowd until she reached Caleb's station. He was kneeling on one knee, looking intently at the broken stroller, offering calm reassurance to the anxious mother. "There," Caleb murmured, tightening a small bolt. "It should steer a lot better now. If it gives you more trouble, just come back." As the mother thanked him profusely and departed, Sophie stepped forward. "Busy day?" she asked, voice light but with a hint of shyness. Caleb looked up, a gentle spark lighting his eyes. "Sure is," he said, pushing himself to his feet. "But this is nice. People seem happy to be here. He paused, noticing Sophie's faint smile. And you? How's the triage going? She shrugged, turning momentarily to watch a line of families headed toward a face-painting booth. It's good. Surprising how many folks haven't had a blood pressure check in ages. I'm glad we're offering this for free. Feels like we're actually doing something useful. Caleb nodded. Yeah, helping folks, he said, echoing a simple truth that had guided him all his life. He then looked at her more directly, noting the sincerity in her gaze. You're all settled in town now, I guess? Sophie sensed his underlying question. Why had she really come here? She wanted to answer honestly, but it was complicated. Still, she managed a small, genuine response. I'm here to stay, trying to make it on my own, though that's not always easy. A flicker of understanding passed over Caleb's face. Before either could say more, another volunteer bustled over, carrying a cracked wheelchair armrest that needed immediate attention. Sophie squeezed Caleb's hand gently, almost as a silent promise that they'd talk again soon, then hurried back to the triage station. For a split second, their eyes locked in a mutual acknowledgement. Something more than passing interest was growing between them. All around them, the festival buzzed with cheerful noise, laughter, music, announcements echoing from the stage. But beneath that surface excitement, two people were quietly forging a connection, drawn together by compassion, sincerity, and the unspoken hope that this day might become the turning point neither had planned for but both were beginning to crave. As the afternoon sun reached its peak, the festival grounds grew increasingly crowded. Children scampered about with cotton candy, couples browsed vendor booths, and senior citizens took advantage of free checkups. Caleb found himself juggling a growing line of broken items, rusty bikes, jammed wheelchair parts, even a squeaky garden cart. Although the workload was significant, he felt oddly energized by the appreciative smiles of those he helped. From her station at triage, Sophie periodically looked over. Each time she caught a glimpse of Caleb's rugged, focused face, she felt a reassuring warmth. He was in his element, quietly fixing what others deemed unusable. In her heart, she recognized the parallels with her own nursing, tending to what was fragile or broken. A subtle sense of affinity made her stomach flutter. Eventually, an older man in a plaid shirt came by to have his glucose tested. "You're the new nurse, aren't you?" he asked with a twinkle in his eye. "Yes, sir," Sophie replied, carefully pricking his finger. "I moved here just a couple of weeks ago." He nodded approvingly. "We could use more folks like you and that fella repairing all our busted contraptions." His gaze drifted to where Caleb was stationed. "That's good people right there." Sophie smiled at his words, feeling an inexplicable pride for a man she hardly knew. After finishing her last blood pressure check, Sophie decided to slip away for a quick break. She drifted toward the repair canopy, where Caleb was accepting a folded lawn chair from a grateful volunteer. As soon as Caleb spotted her, the tension in his posture seemed to ease, and he beckoned her over with a friendly grin. "Still holding up?" she asked gently, noticing a light sheen of sweat on his brow. "I'm good," he replied, wiping his forehead with a rag. "Could use some water, though." He let out a chuckle. "Been so busy I haven't even had a chance to grab a drink." Sophie's eyes darted around, spotting a nearby cooler. She popped it open, retrieving a bottle of water. Handing it to him, she teased, "We can't have our star mechanic collapsing in the middle of the event, can we?" He opened the bottle, taking a long drink. "Thanks," he said softly, then glanced at the swirl of festival-goers. "You know, this whole thing turned out better than I expected." Sophie nodded. "For me too. I was worried it might be all pomp and show, but people are genuinely getting help." She paused. "Speaking of which, you mentioned you run or work at a garage. I'm thinking of scheduling a proper check for my car sometime soon." He cracked a small smile. I'd be glad to take a look. Maybe we'll make sure it doesn't overheat on you again, though next time I might have to accept some form of payment. There was a light tease in his tone, but also sincerity. Their conversation might have continued, had a harried-looking volunteer not dashed over. "Mr. Mills, the brake on this wheelchair's completely shot. Can you, Caleb nodded, turning apologetically to Sophie. "Duty calls." "No worries," she replied, stepping back. "I need to get back to the triage anyway." Before leaving, Sophie gave him a gentle pat on the arm, her touch lingering just an instant longer than strictly necessary. A faint blush warmed her cheeks, but she met his eyes with a smile, as though both recognized something wordless passing between them. Their schedules kept them from chatting more, but that brief exchange left them both feeling lighter. Sophie returned to her station with renewed energy, greeting an elderly couple for their checkups. Caleb, in turn, navigated the next repairs with an extra spark of motivation. He glanced now and then across the crowd, half hoping to catch another glimpse of Sophie's bright gaze. Though they'd only spoken for a few minutes, it felt like an important step. Where once they were strangers forced together by a rainstorm, they were now on the verge of genuine friendship, perhaps something more. And within the vibrant hum of the festival, their quiet but growing bond offered a sweet counterpoint to the clamor around them, suggesting that fate, or simple kindness, had a way of drawing two hearts together. By mid-afternoon, the charity event took on an atmosphere reminiscent of a small-town fair. A local band played easygoing country tunes from a makeshift stage. Children laughed as they hopped in a bounce house, and the mouth-watering aroma of barbecued brisket drifted from the food stalls. Somewhere between checking blood pressures and greeting festival attendees, Sophie realized how welcoming this community could be. She'd met half a dozen other nurses who volunteered their off hours, plus a few physicians who stopped by to offer quick consults. One nurse named Ginny chatted excitedly with Sophie, even exchanging phone numbers so they could meet for coffee on an upcoming off day. It felt wonderful to forge connections without the constant worry that people would see her as Dr. Donovan's daughter first, and a capable nurse second. Caleb, too, discovered that he wasn't an outsider here. Dozens of friendly faces thanked him, with some remembering times he'd previously helped them out for free. A retired veteran named Emmett Jameson lingered to swap stories of old cars and mechanical fixes. Emmett pointed to a scar on his arm from a decades-ago war injury, then quipped, "But your workmanship on that old truck of mine probably saved me more times than the doc ever did." Caleb laughed good-naturedly, feeling an unaccustomed sense of belonging. At one point, Sophie hurried over between patient checkups, lightly catching her breath. "Did you see the line at the triage?" she asked, her eyes shining with excitement. "We're swamped, but it's amazing how many folks are getting checkups they might have put off otherwise." Caleb straightened from tightening a bike chain, noticing how Sophie's cheeks glowed with a mix of warmth and exertion. "That's great," he replied, rummaging for a clean rag. "It's one thing to have a hospital in town, but if people aren't comfortable coming in, events like this can really help." Sophie nodded, her gaze trailing off as she thought about the bigger picture. She'd heard murmurs from some hospital staff about an upcoming expansion, an initiative headed by her father that might drastically change the local landscape. Part of her worried about how these small businesses and the garage might be affected. She pushed the thought aside for the moment, resolving to enjoy the day for what it was, a chance to meet people and do some good. Just then, Margaret approached with a smile. "You two seem like the hardest working volunteers around. Take 5 minutes to grab something to eat, okay? The brisket stall is handing out plates to volunteers." Caleb shared a quick glance with Sophie, both realizing they were indeed hungry. They strolled side by side toward the food stalls, occasionally stopping to greet acquaintances. The path meandered past a table draped in red gingham cloth, offering free samples of homemade pies. Sophie's eyes lit up at a slice of apple pie dotted with cinnamon, while Caleb gravitated to the brisket station, grateful for a hearty plate of barbecue. They found a spare patch of grass under a large oak tree and sat down to eat. Between bites, they chatted about the festival, about their impressions of town life, and a little about each other's backgrounds, though Sophie still kept quiet about her father's exact role. Caleb, noticing her hesitation, didn't press. He liked that she was trying to find her place on her own terms. After a few minutes, Emmett strolled by with 2 ice-cold lemonades, handing them over with a roguish grin. "On the house, folks." "We appreciate y'all." Sophie raised the cup in a small toast. "To new friends," she said softly, glancing from Emmett to Caleb with a grateful smile. Caleb echoed the sentiment, clinking his plastic cup gently against hers. That simple moment felt cozy, enveloped by the hum of festival chatter and the gentle strum of guitars in the background. Sophie recognized the subtle shift in her own heart. For the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of genuine camaraderie, of being part of something rather than watching from the edges. Caleb, too, let down his guard, if only for a moment, grateful for a day that reminded him life wasn't just about routine repairs and solitary evenings. As they finished their impromptu lunch, the call of duty beckoned them back, Caleb to his canopy of squeaky wheels, Sophie to her line of patients in need of checkups. Yet the warmth of that shared meal lingered, fortifying them against whatever challenges might arise next. And as they parted ways, both carried the sense that this day was shaping into more than just a community gathering. It was laying the groundwork for deeper bonds and unspoken possibilities still to come. Late afternoon sun angled across the fairgrounds, illuminating the crowd that had only grown denser as the day went on. Children chased each other around clusters of folding chairs while local musicians closed out their final set. Sophie, finishing up a glucose test for a chatty older woman, sensed a growing tension in the air, an undercurrent she couldn't quite place. Moments later, she spotted the reason. Her father, Dr. Richard Donovan, had arrived on site with a few hospital board members. Standing near the stage, he looked every bit the dignified businessman, tall, silver hair brushed neatly, wearing a crisp suit despite the day's casual atmosphere. Board members hovered around him, pointing toward different parts of the festival. Their presence commanded attention, and Sophie's heart sank. She knew he had come to make an appearance, perhaps even give a little speech about the hospital's future, but seeing him here, so formal and imposing, filled her with unease. Across the festival, Caleb was handing a newly repaired wheelchair back to a relieved senior citizen. As he turned to grab another tool, he noticed a commotion by the stage. A cluster of well-dressed individuals strode across the lawn, led by a commanding older man. Caleb recognized him immediately from the local newspaper's front page, Dr. Donovan, the new hospital owner. Something about the man's confident stride and no-nonsense expression gave Caleb pause. Just then, Dr. Donovan caught sight of Caleb at the repair station. It took him a moment to connect the dots, but recognition soon dawned in his eyes. He had heard about a local mechanic who'd been volunteering his services today. But he also recalled Sophie's mention of a roadside assistance incident on her first day. His expression hardened. If this was the man who had grown close, perhaps too close, to his daughter, Donovan wanted to see him up close, size him up. Without warning, Dr. Donovan peeled away from his board members and strode toward Caleb. The festival chatter seemed to dull around them as he approached. Caleb felt an instinctive tightening in his gut. "You're Mr. Mills, correct?" Dr. Donovan asked, voice clipped but polite. Caleb nodded, setting down a wrench. "I am. Can I help you with something, sir?" Dr. Donovan regarded Caleb's disheveled hair, grease-stained hands, and simple attire. "I've heard about your generosity," he said. "Fixing cars on the roadside, repairing equipment here for free, admirable. But I do hope there's no misunderstanding about your motivations. Especially where my daughter is concerned." Caleb blinked, his jaw tensing. He didn't like where this was going. "I don't think I follow," he responded quietly, mindful that a few bystanders were eavesdropping. The doctor's gaze sharpened. "Sophie, she's new here, eager to make an impression. I'd hate for her to get entangled in any arrangement that could undermine her position or reputation at the hospital." A slow burn ignited in Caleb's chest, but he kept his voice calm. "With all due respect, Dr. Donovan, your daughter doesn't owe me anything. I helped her out because she needed it, same as I've done for others." From a short distance away, Sophie spotted the tense exchange and felt her stomach twist in alarm. She quickly handed off the nurse's station to a colleague and headed toward the repair canopy. By the time she reached them, Dr. Donovan's voice was low, measured, but unmistakably confrontational. "I appreciate good deeds, Mr. Mills. But let's be clear, my family and my hospital are not your personal stepping stones." His tone brimmed with cold warning. Caleb inhaled, struggling to hold back his anger. "I don't need stepping stones, sir. I have my own business. And I'm no charity case. If anything, I'm the one who's been giving to this community." At that moment, Sophie interjected, placing herself between them. "Dad, please," she whispered, cheeks flushed. "This isn't the time or place." Dr. Donovan's stern gaze flicked to Sophie, then back to Caleb, as if ensuring his message had been received. Without another word, he turned on his heel and strode away, returning to the group of board members who watched the scene from a polite distance. Caleb exhaled, frustration and confusion churning inside him. Sophie reached for his arm. "I'm so sorry," she said softly, searching his eyes with genuine regret. But in Caleb's mind, Dr. Donovan's warning rattled loudly, echoing a lifelong fear of being seen as unworthy or opportunistic. Before she could explain, Caleb stepped back, shaking his head. "It's fine," he mumbled, though clearly it wasn't. Then he gathered his tools and walked away, heart pounding, leaving Sophie torn between her loyalty to her father and her growing concern for the one man who, until just moments ago, had made her feel truly seen. The sun sank low on the horizon by the time the charity event wrapped up. Streamers and banners still fluttered in the lingering breeze, but most booths had closed. Volunteers packed up tables and tents, calling goodbyes across the lawn. Sophie Donovan stood near the triage station, heart heavy as she replayed the tense exchange between her father and Caleb Mills. A nagging sense of guilt weighed on her. She couldn't forget the look in Caleb's eyes when Dr. Donovan implied he might be using Sophie for personal gain. Caleb had walked away without letting her explain, leaving her clutching her stethoscope in helpless frustration. At the same time, she knew her father felt protective, though in a way that bordered on controlling. Torn between two worlds, Sophie felt more alone than ever. By the time she finished helping pack medical supplies into the hospital van, Caleb was gone. She scanned the grounds but saw no sign of his truck. Margaret Blake, sensing Sophie's turmoil, approached with a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Give him a day or two, honey," she said in her warm, maternal tone. "He's probably upset, and rightfully so, but I've seen the way you two look at each other. This may not be the end." Sophie bit her lip. "I just wish my father had stayed out of it, or at least tried to talk to Caleb without accusing him." Margaret smiled sympathetically. "Dr. Donovan's a proud man, but you're your own person. Don't forget that." Meanwhile, across town, Caleb parked his truck outside the small roadside garage. He sat behind the wheel for a few moments, gazing at the dimly lit sign. He couldn't erase Dr. Donovan's cutting words from his mind, nor the ache of feeling belittled. Memories of past instances when well-to-do folks treated him like a convenient fix-it man flickered through his head. He had tried to let those slights roll off his back, but seeing that same attitude in Sophie's father felt like a punch to the gut. He stepped out of the truck, exhaling sharply as he walked inside. Bobby Coleman was there, sweeping the floor. At the sound of the door, Bobby glanced up, his grin fading when he caught Caleb's hardened expression. "Hey, man, you look like you got run over by a tractor." "What happened?" Caleb dropped his toolbox onto the workbench with a thud. "Dr. Donovan happened. Called me out in the middle of the festival. Pretty much accused me of taking advantage of Sophie, like I'm after her or the hospital's money." Bobby whistled softly. "That's rough. I'm sorry, but you know that's not true." "Yeah, well, doesn't matter if he's the guy signing paychecks around here," Caleb muttered, jaw clenched. He paused, shaking his head. "I don't know what to do with all this. I feel betrayed, but Sophie didn't do anything wrong." They locked up the garage in silence. The day that had started so hopefully had taken a sour turn, leaving Caleb's mood in tatters. He knew deep down that Sophie wasn't to blame, but she was still part of that Donovan family, part of the hospital threatening to expand in ways he suspected could hurt local businesses. If Dr. Donovan truly had power to reshape the town, perhaps even the humble roadside garage wasn't safe from future demolition or relocation. That night, Sophie tried calling Caleb twice, but each attempt went straight to voicemail. She left a brief message, voice tight with emotion. "Caleb, I'm so sorry about what happened. I wish you'd let me explain. Please call me back if you can." Caleb lay awake in his small, sparsely furnished living room, phone silent on the coffee table. He stared at the ceiling, torn between the sting of Dr. Donovan's accusations and the memory of Sophie's genuine warmth. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and he drifted into a restless sleep. Yet both of them knew that something essential had shifted. The tenderness they'd been carefully nurturing now stood on fragile ground. And looming over everything was the question of the hospital's expansion, a development that might bring prosperity for some, but would spell real trouble for others like Caleb. Unresolved, the tension of that day threatened to widen the divide between them, pushing their tenuous bond toward a point of rupture neither had wanted, yet both feared might be inevitable. The following morning, a somber mood settled over the small Pennsylvania town. The charity event had been declared a success in local news, but behind the scenes, ripples of unease spread. Talk of the hospital's potential expansion project began surfacing, stoking fears among small business owners. Some whispered that Dr. Donovan intended to buy up more land around the facility, possibly leading to higher rents or forced relocation. Caleb Mills unlocked the garage around 8, his heart not in it. Ordinarily, he found comfort in the clang of metal and the hum of engines, but today he moved mechanically from one task to the next. Bobby Coleman noticed his friend's distraction and gently prodded. "Any chance you talk to Sophie?" Caleb shook his head, fiddling with a carburetor. "No, I got her voicemail, but I just didn't feel ready. Feels like there's more at stake than just my pride here." Bobby nodded, concern etched on his features. "You know, there's a rumor floating around that Dr. Donovan's expansion might stretch all the way up this road, maybe turning it into a commercial zone. That could mean big changes for this old garage." A heavy silence fell. Caleb clenched his jaw, then let out a weary sigh. "I've heard the same. The new owner of the hospital is apparently unstoppable. Guess that's what power and money can do." He paused, eyes flicking toward the front door. "All the same, Sophie didn't have anything to do with those decisions. I need to remember that." Meanwhile, at the hospital, Sophie navigated the corridors, her steps echoing in the tiled hallway. She felt the quiet weight of her colleagues' glances, some sympathetic, some curious. Though none openly mentioned the confrontation at the festival, rumor mills churned. In the staff lounge, she found Margaret sipping coffee alone, eyes scanning a newspaper spread out on the table. "Morning," Sophie greeted, sinking into a chair beside her. The front page headline declared, "Hospital's charity event a hit, talk of expansion grows." Sophie's stomach fluttered uneasily at the sight. Margaret folded the paper. "There's been chatter. People are concerned about potential layoffs or department shifts. Dr. Donovan's plans aren't fully transparent yet. Some staffers worry the hospital might take a direction that emphasizes profit over community care." Sophie nodded. "I've seen glimpses of the proposals. They're ambitious, but they could displace local businesses and, well, I'm worried." Margaret studied her for a moment. "Worried about the town or worried about Caleb?" Sophie sighed, cheeks warming. "Both. I tried calling him, but he hasn't called back. And I've been thinking, if my father's expansion plans threaten his garage, that's more reason for Caleb to resent me." Margaret set down her coffee and leaned in. "Listen, dear. I've worked under plenty of administrators. Big personalities who think they know best for everyone. Doesn't always mean they're right, but it also doesn't mean you have to stand aside. If you believe the project's flawed, use your voice. You might not sway your father entirely, but you can make him listen." That afternoon, Sophie discovered a growing group of local merchants, city officials, and citizens gathering at the town hall to discuss the expansion rumors. She stood at the back of the small meeting room, listening as Larry Wilson, the owner of a nearby grocery store, lamented that rising property costs could force him out of business. A local farmer worried about losing land to parking lots. Sophie felt torn. Technically, she was a Donovan and should be supporting her father's project, but her conscience kept nagging that something about the scope of these plans wasn't right for the town she was starting to love. From a distance, she spotted Caleb in the crowd, arms folded, expression grim. His gaze flicked to her once, then slid away. The sting of that dismissal only fueled her resolve. After the meeting ended, she lingered in the hallway, wondering if Caleb might approach her. Instead, he kept a careful distance, speaking quietly with Bobby and a couple of other merchants. Sophie realized she'd have to be the one to make the next move, whether that meant confronting her father about scaling back the expansion or finding a way to protect the people she'd come to respect. And just maybe prove to Caleb that she wasn't his enemy, but an ally in a fight that was growing larger than either of them anticipated. Time in the small town seemed to accelerate as talks about the hospital expansion intensified. Dr. Richard Donovan dispatched representatives to local council meetings, brandishing glossy brochures promising economic growth and improved healthcare infrastructure. Yet behind the slick marketing, many residents, particularly small business owners, feared they would be bulldozed in the process. At the roadside garage, Caleb and Bobby found themselves inundated with concerned locals. Some came under the guise of needing quick repairs, but really they sought reassurance or a plan. "We're not alone in this, right?" asked Mary Jenkins, a kindly middle-aged woman who ran a nearby bakery. "If the hospital builds out that far, I'll lose my storefront." Caleb tried to sound confident, though his insides churned. "We'll figure something out. The town council hasn't signed off yet, and we can raise concerns at future hearings." Meanwhile, Sophie grappled with her own set of fears inside the hospital corridors. She overheard conversations among doctors and nurses speculating about staff cuts or departmental shifts to fund the expansion. Privately, she studied the outline her father's office had circulated, proposing a massive new wing, extra parking lots, and possible deals with outside corporations. The more she read, the more uneasy she became. Her father's intentions might be good in theory: modernize healthcare, attract more patients, but the cost to the community felt too high. He was forging ahead with minimal local input, confident his expertise overrode small-town sentiments. Sophie recognized that uncompromising streak, one she had lived under for years. But no matter how often she tried to muster courage, confronting him directly felt like scaling a mountain with no footholds. One evening, she mustered enough nerve to knock on her father's office door. The rich mahogany desk and shelves, lined with medical textbooks, gave the room an imposing aura. Dr. Donovan glanced up, adjusting his reading glasses. "Sophie, come in," he said briskly. "Busy, but I can give you a moment." Her stomach knotted. "Dad, I've been reading over the expansion plans," she began carefully. "I'm worried about the impact on small businesses, like the local mechanics shop, the bakery, and—" He raised a hand, silencing her. "You've heard too many rumors. We're offering fair compensation for any property needed. This town stands to benefit from better facilities and more jobs." Sophie's pulse quickened. "But from what I understand, many local owners can't afford to relocate, even with compensation. They may lose customers if forced to move farther out. And the sense of community—" "That's enough," her father cut in. His gaze hardened. "I appreciate your concern, but you're not an expert on development or administration. Stick to your nursing role. Let the hospital's leadership handle the broader vision." She swallowed hard, every fiber of her being wanting to persist. Yet the old pang of intimidation rose in her chest, the memory of how her father's disappointment always stung. She offered a small nod and left, frustration roiling beneath her polite exterior. Outside, the early autumn sky was streaked with oranges and purples. Sophie paused on the hospital's front steps, breathing in the evening air. She couldn't just watch this happen. She had to do something. Her father's dismissal was expected, but it still hurt. Gathering her thoughts, she decided to attend the next community meeting, this time not as a silent observer. Elsewhere, in his modest living room, Caleb flipped through local papers spread out on his coffee table. Articles about the expansion project dominated the headlines. Each piece felt like a blow, confirming his fear that the hospital's unstoppable plan would eventually swallow up the roadside garage and more. He thought about calling Sophie, an impulse born from the memory of her kind smile, but doubt gnawed at him. Was she truly on his side? Or was her loyalty to her father and the hospital too strong to break? The weight of these unanswered questions pressed on them both. Like standing before a colossal mountain, each step forward was met with new barriers. Sophie needed to find her voice in the face of her father's authority. Caleb needed to rally with other local owners, no longer content to rely on quiet endurance. And somehow, amid all these looming pressures, they both had to decide whether the fragile bond they'd begun forging could survive the inevitable storm ahead. A tense week slipped by, each day bringing fresh debates at City Hall and new speculation in the local paper. Some community members felt tempted by the promise of progress. Others feared losing the essence of their hometown. In the midst of it all, Caleb Mills kept toiling at the garage, trying not to let the uncertainty paralyze him. Late one afternoon, after finishing a truck repair, he stepped outside and found Sophie Donovan standing by his pickup. The sky glowed with the warm palette of a setting sun. She wore her nurse's scrubs under a casual jacket, her expression a mix of apology and determination. "Hi," she said quietly, looking up at him. Her hands fidgeted with the edge of the jacket. "I'm sorry to just show up, but I needed to talk to you. Can I come in?" Caleb hesitated, heart thudding, even after days of silence. Seeing her awakened the feelings he'd tried to bury. He gave a short nod and gestured for her to follow him inside. The interior of the garage smelled of motor oil and old leather, the floor cluttered with tools. They settled near a small workbench, the overhead light casting a gentle glow on their faces. Sophie took a breath, as though gathering courage. "I know you've been avoiding me, and I don't blame you. My father's words at the festival were harsh. He doesn't understand how you helped me without expecting anything in return." Caleb crossed his arms, leaning against a shelf. "He's your father, Sophie. You don't need to apologize for him." But it stung. "Yeah. And then this expansion thing. It feels like the hospital is a bulldozer, and we're just a bunch of roadside obstacles." Sophie's eyes flickered with empathy. "I've been digging into the project details. It's more expansive than I realized. The hospital is pushing to secure a significant chunk of land around the existing campus. If they get it, shops like yours, Mary's Bakery, Larry's Grocery, they could all be forced to relocate or sell." I confronted my father. He brushed off my concerns. Caleb forced a sigh. "Figures." A tight silence followed, though he sensed Sophie had more to say. Finally, she continued, her voice quivering with conviction. "I'm not okay with it. I didn't come here to overshadow people or let my father's ambitions displace an entire community. That's why I've been attending the council meetings, trying to show them alternative proposals. I even have some contacts who might help me question the legality of acquiring certain properties." She offered him a folder of documents. "Notes I've compiled, possible ways to slow or amend the project so local businesses aren't destroyed." He looked down at the folder, then at her. "You're serious about this?" There was a tinge of surprise in his tone, mingled with cautious hope. She nodded firmly. "I am. I believe in expanding healthcare access, but not at the cost of uprooting everyone else's livelihood. I want to help the town find a middle ground." Their gazes locked, the emotional undercurrent too strong to ignore. "I appreciate you telling me all this," he said quietly. I was so angry after your father confronted me that I assumed you'd side with him. But you're risking a lot to do this, aren't you?" Sophie mustered a faint smile. "I might lose my father's approval, maybe even my position if he feels I'm undermining the hospital, but I can't stand by and watch people I care about suffer. This town is starting to feel like my home, too." His shoulders relaxed. In that moment, the tension and mistrust between them eased, replaced by a fragile sense of alliance. He gently reached for her hand. "You're a good person, Sophie Donovan," he murmured, a flicker of admiration glinting in his eyes. For the first time in days, a faint light pierced the darkness that had overshadowed them. They stood side by side, poring over her research, discussing strategies. Outside, evening settled into night, but inside the garage, a quiet fire of determination burned. Neither knew if they could truly halt Dr. Donovan's ambitions or sway the hospital board, yet in that worn, oil-scented workshop they forged a pact to fight for the town's future. And in doing so, they reignited the tender spark that had first emerged on a rain-soaked roadside, uniting them with renewed purpose and the hope that together they might shine a light bright enough to guide the entire community through whatever dark times lay ahead. Over the next several days, the garage transformed into an unofficial command center for the concerned citizens rallying against the hospital's overreach. Tables were pushed together, strewn with papers, maps, and notes that Sophie Donovan had gathered. Caleb Mills coordinated with local merchants who trickled in and out, sharing their worries and lending support. One evening, Margaret Blake joined them after her hospital shift ended, bringing fresh-baked cookies and a warm smile. Bobby Coleman was there, too, scribbling down ideas on a notepad. Larry Wilson, the anxious grocery store owner, flipped through building permits and zoning regulations. Even Emmett Jameson, the retired veteran who used a cane, chimed in with stories of communities he'd seen swallowed up by urban sprawl. They formed an unlikely coalition: nurses, mechanics, storekeepers, and everyday residents determined to speak up. Sophie, perched on a stool, highlighted sections of the proposed expansion plan where she believed they could negotiate for smaller-scale development. "Look, the hospital wants to add a new wing and more parking. But does it have to be so huge that it bulldozes half of Main Street?" she argued. "Maybe we can get them to scale back or relocate certain facilities." Bobby ran a hand over his short beard, glancing at Caleb. "And how do we even get Dr. Donovan's attention?" "He's got money, connections, a way of brushing people off." Sophie's jaw tightened. "I'm his daughter, and he brushes me off too. But if we collect testimonies from enough citizens, present them at the next council meeting, we can put pressure on him publicly. Even Dad can't ignore a united front." Caleb nodded, wearing an air of quiet resolve. "We've got to show that the town isn't against hospital improvements, just that we want them done responsibly. We're not anti-progress, we just don't want to be steamrolled." As they strategized, Margaret offered her perspective from inside the hospital. Some staff fear losing their jobs if Dr. Donovan pulls his funding. They're afraid to speak up, but a few are willing to sign a letter supporting a moderated expansion. I'll talk to them, see if we can get their signatures. Meanwhile, Emmett chimed in about gathering historical data. If the buildings on Main Street have some historical or cultural value, the hospital might face extra hurdles in demolishing or annexing them. Larry leaned forward, hope glimmering in his tired eyes. "You think that could buy us more time?" Sophie nodded. "Absolutely. At least enough to push for an alternative proposal that spares local businesses." Night deepened outside, the hum of passing cars thinning to near silence. Yet the group pressed on, forging a plan of action. They would gather petitions, compile stories from elderly residents, collect statements from vendors who'd been part of the town for generations. Each piece of information felt like a building block in a wall of resistance, a buffer against the hospital's unstoppable facade. When the meeting finally wrapped, Bobby and Larry headed home, leaving Sophie and Caleb tidying up scattered papers and cookie crumbs. Margaret had slipped out earlier with a gentle promise to handle hospital staff outreach. Caleb ran a hand through his hair, eyes scanning the reorganized documents. He glanced at Sophie, who was hugging the folder of proposals against her chest. "You know, I never pictured I'd be leading a charge like this," he murmured with a half-smile. "I'm more of a fix one thing at a time kind of guy." Sophie's lips curved into a soft grin. "And I always thought I'd be working under my father's umbrella, just content to be a nurse. Funny how life changes when you realize something bigger is at stake." They shared a moment of mutual understanding, both carrying weighty personal stakes in this fight. For Sophie, it was standing up to a father she'd never challenged so directly. For Caleb, it was protecting the home he'd built on honest work and devotion to the community. The spark between them felt stronger than ever, forged now in purpose as well as affection. As Caleb reached to flick off the overhead light, Sophie rested a hand on his shoulder. "Thank you," she whispered, "for trusting me enough to do this together." He turned, gently clasping her hand. "Thank you for standing up for us, even if it means standing against your own father." They stepped outside into the cool night air, the moon casting pale silver across the quiet street. Neither had illusions about the difficulty of the battle ahead, yet they felt a renewed sense of hope. Together, they were preparing for a confrontation that would test not only their determination, but also the fragile bond blossoming between them. And if they succeeded, they wouldn't just save a few buildings, they might just reshape an entire future, proving that even the toughest battles can be met head-on when hearts and minds unite. A hush fell over the crowded municipal auditorium as the gavel struck wood. The town council meeting was about to begin. and half the residents of the small Pennsylvania community seemed to have squeezed into the fold-out chairs. A projector screen displayed the hospital's proposed expansion plans, glossy digital renderings of sleek buildings, expanded parking lots, and modern amenities. Yet, despite the polished presentation, the tension in the air was palpable. Sophie Donovan sat in the second row, her fingers laced nervously in her lap. On her right, Margaret Blake clutched a manila folder stuffed with signed statements from hospital staff who wanted a gentler approach to growth. On Sophie's left, Caleb Mills waited, arms folded, eyes fixed on the front of the room. Behind them, a sea of community members, shop owners, farmers, retirees, murmured in hushed tones about what might happen if the council approved the plan unchallenged. Seated at a long table along the front wall, Dr. Richard Donovan and his entourage prepared to make their case. He wore a finely tailored suit, and his posture exuded confidence. Once the council chairperson finished initial announcements, she gestured toward Dr. Donovan. "We'll hear from the hospital board first." With a quick nod, Dr. Donovan rose, clicked through a slide deck, and spoke in a steady, practiced tone. He highlighted the potential benefits: new jobs, improved patient care, updated facilities. Each slide showed architectural models that looked undeniably impressive. Many in the crowd nodded in interest or murmured approval. Caleb could feel his stomach knot. He recognized the salesmanship, factual numbers mixed with broad promises of economic uplift. But he also knew the heartbreak behind the scenes: people forced to relocate, businesses shuttered, a community identity swallowed up by a corporate footprint. When Dr. Donovan concluded, the council chair invited questions or statements. Larry Wilson stood, voice quavering, clutching a piece of paper. "Sir, I run a grocery store that's been in my family for decades. I've read the hospital's plan. Your new parking lot would go right where my store stands. The compensation you're offering wouldn't cover the cost of re-establishing somewhere else." He hesitated, swallowing hard. "Is that really progress? For me to lose my livelihood?" Dr. Donovan inclined his head, but offered a measured reply. "I understand your concerns, Mr. Wilson. Progress, however, sometimes requires sacrifice. We're committed to fair market value compensation, and I'm certain we can find alternative locations that serve your store's needs." Anger rippled through the audience. Several voices rose, but the council chair hammered the gavel, restoring order. Sophie felt her pulse spike. She knew it was now or never. Standing, she cleared her throat. "Madam Chair, may I speak?" The chair nodded, and the crowd shifted with curiosity. Sophie glanced at her father, who observed her with an impassive stare. She steadied her breath. "My name is Sophie Donovan. I'm a nurse at the hospital, and also Dr. Donovan's daughter. But I'm here as a member of this community. I've reviewed the expansion plans. While I support better healthcare, I believe the current proposal is too large, too disruptive." She turned to face the crowd, drawing courage from the presence of Margaret, Caleb, and others. "What if we scale back the parking area, upgrade existing buildings, and incorporate more of the local businesses into the design instead of shutting them down? Here," she held up a small binder, "are alternate strategies drafted by volunteers and some hospital staff. We want the hospital to succeed, but not at the expense of the entire town's character." A heavy silence gripped the room. Dr. Donovan's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening. For a moment, it looked as though he might interrupt, but he remained still. Sophie pressed on, voice trembling. "These people are the heartbeat of this town. We can't simply wipe them away for the sake of bigger profits and bigger parking lots." At that, Caleb stood too, supporting Sophie's words. "I own a small garage that served folks here for years. This town depends on neighbors helping neighbors. The hospital should be part of that spirit, not replace it. Murmurs of agreement swept through the rows, and Dr. Donovan's composure slipped ever so slightly. The council members eyed one another, brows furrowed with sudden uncertainty. The seeds of doubt were clearly planted. The session ran late, with council members debating the scope of the expansion. Dr. Donovan fought back, warning that any delays could result in lost funding and missed opportunities. Yet the floodgates of community testimony were opened. Shop owners, farmers, teachers all stepped up with concerns about preserving the town's unique identity. By the time the gavel fell again, everyone felt the gravity of what had transpired. Sophie had publicly defied her father, and the hospital's leadership had been forced to concede that the issue required more discussion. A final decision was postponed until further review. In the dimming light of that evening, Sophie and Caleb shared a brief moment outside the auditorium. "Thank you," she said, her voice catching, "for standing with me." Caleb's gaze flicked to Dr. Donovan's retreating figure. "We're not done yet," he murmured, "but at least they're starting to listen." They parted ways, both bracing for the coming fallout, a father's wounded pride, a hospital board's frustration, and a community newly empowered to face power on its own terms. The day after the tumultuous council meeting, Sophie Donovan arrived at the hospital with mixed emotions. Part of her felt relief that the town had forced a delay in the expansion plans. Yet she also dreaded encountering her father, Dr. Richard Donovan, knowing how deeply he prized control and decisiveness. She placed her bag in her locker with trembling hands, bracing for some kind of confrontation. Morning rounds were uneventful at first. Sophie assisted with patient check-ins, administered medication, and recorded vital signs. Margaret Blake gave her a comforting smile whenever their paths crossed. "You did something brave," Margaret said, her voice low as they passed in a hallway. "People in town are talking about it. They admire your stand." Sophie managed a small smile, but couldn't shake the anxious flutter in her stomach. She knew her father's silence could be more foreboding than an outright argument. He'd grown quiet after the council meeting, offering no direct remark to her despite seeing her speak out. She feared the storm was only gathering strength. A couple of hours into her shift, one of Dr. Donovan's secretaries found Sophie and said, "Dr. Donovan would like to speak with you in his office." Sophie exhaled sharply, thanked the secretary, and made her way up. In the polished, wood-paneled office, Dr. Donovan sat behind his grand desk, hands folded. No staff or board members hovered nearby, suggesting this was intended as a private discussion. He looked up when she entered, expression unreadable. "Close the door, Sophie," he said calmly. She complied, then stood uncertainly, waiting for him to speak. After a tense moment, he gestured for her to sit. "You surprised me yesterday," he began, voice measured. "I knew you had concerns, but I never imagined you'd present an alternate proposal so publicly." Sophie swallowed. "Dad, I'm not against the hospital's growth. I just—" He raised a hand, silencing her gently. "Let me finish. This expansion is a major investment, not just for me, but for outside partners counting on returns. Delays could jeopardize our timeline, possibly our funding. The board is furious." Her heart pounded. "I understand, but the community—" He leaned forward, gaze intense. "The community doesn't always know what's best for it. And your public stance undermined not only our project, but my authority in front of the council." A flicker of anger surfaced in his eyes. "I respect your nursing skills, Sophie, but this is not your field of expertise. You've overstepped." Sophie's cheeks flushed. His dismissive tone stung. She drew in a shaky breath, determined not to buckle. "I had to. People's lives and livelihoods are at stake. Even some hospital staff support rethinking the plan. We can do this in a way that preserves more of the town." Dr. Donovan took a measured breath. "Perhaps, But what if it can't be done feasibly? Are you prepared to face the consequences if the hospital loses critical funding or the project collapses altogether? She pressed her lips together, refusing to look away. If that happens because we refuse to consider community needs, then maybe it wasn't the right project in the first place. A frigid silence stretched between them. Sophie's mind flashed with memories of her childhood, instances where she'd craved her father's approval, only to find his standards near impossible to meet. But this time, she sensed a shift within herself. She wasn't a little girl anymore. She had convictions of her own. Finally, Dr. Donovan leaned back. I can't stop you from advocating for those local businesses. But be aware that if you continue this path, there may be repercussions for your role here. The board might question where your loyalties lie. Despite the chill in her veins, Sophie squared her shoulders. I'll keep doing my job as a nurse, caring for patients, and I'll keep fighting for the town. If that's a problem, then let the board come to me. I won't be silent. For a beat, neither spoke. Then Dr. Donovan gave a curt nod, dismissed her with a mere flick of his hand. She left his office, head swirling, feeling equal parts terrified and liberated. Later, as she drove home, the weight of her father's warning pressed down on her, but so did a sense of resolve. She recalled the warm gratitude in the eyes of Mary Jenkins, Larry Wilson, and even Emmett Jameson, people who relied on the small-town fabric for their livelihoods. She thought of Caleb's unwavering support, of how he stood by her in the council meeting, offering a silent but powerful testament to their growing bond. Sophie didn't know if the hospital board would truly threaten her job or if her father would push her aside. But one thing was certain: she would fight on. And perhaps, in proving her commitment to her community, she'd find that in healing those rifts, she was also healing long-standing wounds in her own heart. In the days that followed, the small coalition of townspeople grew more organized, bolstered by the momentum from Sophie Donovan's public stand at the council. Flyers appeared around Main Street announcing a community forum, inviting anyone to discuss how to balance modernization with preserving local heritage. Caleb Mills volunteered his garage once again as a central meeting place, and people gathered there in the evenings, brainstorming strategies. Yet beneath the surge of civic engagement, Sophie felt a deepening sense of conflict. Her father's silent disapproval hovered like a storm cloud, and she felt the strain each time she clocked in for her hospital shifts. She'd become a focal point for speculation. Some co-workers called her heroic for championing small businesses, while others questioned whether she was biting the hand that fed her. Only Margaret's calm, steady presence kept Sophie from succumbing to self-doubt. It was during one of these late-night meetings at the garage that the weight of her choice truly pressed in. The room buzzed with conversation. Larry Wilson plotted out alternative parking designs on a large sheet of paper. Mary Jenkins circulated a petition for fair relocation assistance. Bobby Coleman sorted through spreadsheets that showed projected costs. Sophie looked around, seeing the hope in everyone's eyes, and realized that if the community lost, these people could be shattered. As the discussions wound down, she noticed Caleb sitting quietly by the tool bench, leafing through some printed articles about hospital expansions elsewhere in the state. She approached him softly. "You okay?" she asked, pulling up a stool. He offered a small smile, though his expression was tinged with concern. "Yeah, I'm fine. Just trying to figure out the next steps if we don't succeed, like, do we have a backup plan? And then there's your father." Sophie's shoulders tensed. "He's been cold at work. I think he's waiting to see if I'll back down." She sighed, gazing at the scattered papers. "It's a lot of responsibility. If the expansion fails entirely, the hospital might lose funding. Staff could get laid off. It's a lose-lose unless we find a genuine middle ground." Caleb leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "And you feel like it's all on your shoulders?" She hesitated before nodding. I guess I do. It's my father's project. I'm the one who spoke out publicly. Sometimes I wonder if I should have stayed quiet." Reaching out, he gently took her hand. "You know that's not an option for you, right? Being quiet might save you short-term pain, but it'd go against who you are. I see how you care about people here." His sincerity caught Sophie off guard, and tears burned at the corners of her eyes. They had been flirting with deeper emotions for weeks now, but the enormity of what they were fighting for overshadowed any personal confessions. Still, in that simple hand-holding moment, Sophie sensed an anchor, a reminder she wasn't alone in this uphill battle. "I'm just afraid," she whispered, voice trembling, "afraid I'll lose my job, my father's respect, or even you, if things get too complicated." Caleb's grip on her hand tightened, a hint of protectiveness shining in his gaze. "I'm not going anywhere. We're in this together, and whatever happens, we'll figure it out." She let out a shaky breath, nodding. For so long, she'd struggled to carve out her own identity, separate from her father's wealth and influence. Now she was doing just that, yet the personal cost felt immense. Emmett Jameson hobbled over with his cane, clearing his throat. "Hate to interrupt, but the group is finishing up. We wanted your thoughts on that open forum next week." Sophie blinked away unshed tears and stood. "Yes, of course," she said, sliding back into the role of organizer. She and Caleb moved to join the others, discussing date options, location, and potential speakers. Every decision felt monumental, but also affirming. Their entire cause revolved around giving local voices a platform to find genuine solutions. When the meeting ended, Sophie walked outside under a sky sprinkled with stars. Her heart still fluttered with an undercurrent of fear, but she held on to the promise that integrity and kindness could guide her choices. And with Caleb at her side, she felt a growing certainty that love, like community, could thrive even under the heaviest burdens, provided they faced them honestly and together. A brisk autumn wind rattled the leaves outside the old community center, where folding chairs had been arranged in neat rows for the community forum. Flyers, pinned around town by volunteers, advertised an open invitation for residents to debate the hospital expansion. A sense of both trepidation and hope hung in the air as neighbors filed in, chatting quietly about what the evening might bring. Sophie Donovan arrived early, arms loaded with documents, diagrams of alternative development plans, letters of support from local nurses, and financial breakdowns that Margaret Blake had helped compile. The chilly breeze bit at her cheeks, but her resolve felt unwavering. This was it, the forum that might tilt public perception enough to force the hospital board into a real compromise. Caleb Mills stepped up beside her, hauling a box of petitions he'd collected from business owners and families who feared displacement. He caught her eye and offered a reassuring nod. "We're ready," he murmured, the warmth in his voice cutting through the cold. As folks settled in, a small dais stood at the front of the room. A microphone crackled to life as Mary Jenkins welcomed everyone. She explained the evening's format. First, presentations from those proposing alternatives, then an open floor for questions and discussion. While this wasn't an official council meeting, Mary hoped it would inform the next steps for elected officials and, hopefully, the hospital board. The first few speakers were long-time residents who recounted the town's history, how Main Street formed decades ago, how generations of families built their lives around small commerce and tight-knit neighborly bonds. One older gentleman mentioned his grandfather's blacksmith shop from the early 1900s, the building still standing near Larry Wilson's grocery store. When Sophie rose to speak, a hush settled. She introduced herself again, not as Dr. Donovan's daughter, but as a nurse passionate about serving the community. Then she presented the revised proposals she'd compiled with the coalition. There's a way to expand the hospital's capacity without erasing local businesses, she explained, pointing to diagrams that factored in multi-level parking garages rather than sprawling lots, and renovations to existing hospital wings instead of entire rebuilds. She emphasized the cost savings of building upward, not outward, and described how preserving Main Street storefronts could encourage visitors to support local shops. Her voice faltered slightly when she mentioned the role of compassion in every nurse's training, that a community's well-being involved more than just medical care, but also economic and social stability. After Sophie finished, Caleb took the mic briefly. He spoke plainly about what his garage meant to him and others, an honest livelihood, a place where folks could count on fair prices and friendly service. "We can't just say progress means pushing out the very heart of the community," he said in a measured tone. "We need solutions that help the hospital grow but keep the town's spirit intact." Applause echoed around the room, mingling with murmurs of agreement. Then came the open floor discussion. Some residents worried about the hospital losing potential grants. Others felt the board's timeline was too rushed. A few voiced concerns about whether the hospital's leadership would ever truly listen. Midway through the forum, a ripple of surprise swept through the crowd as Dr. Richard Donovan himself entered. He wore a dark overcoat, shoulders squared, gaze scanning the assembled townspeople. Sophie's stomach twisted at the sight of her father's arrival, but she took a steadying breath. Better he hear the community's voices directly than remain sequestered in an office. Mary Jenkins invited him to speak. Slowly, he approached the mic, his eyes flicking between Sophie and Caleb before settling on the audience. "I understand the concerns being raised here," he began in his deliberate, composed manner, "and I won't pretend to be unmoved by them. However, the hospital board has financial obligations and deadlines. We can't simply halt progress for sentiment." A few unhappy murmurs broke out. Dr. Donovan's jaw tightened. "That said, we hear you. The board has agreed to review alternative proposals," he paused, glancing at Sophie's display boards, "including these, which my daughter has insisted upon." A spark of hope rippled through the crowd, but Dr. Donovan also maintained a steely firmness. "I must caution that no final decisions can be made tonight. The board will need tangible evidence that any revised plan remains viable." Sophie caught her father's eye, seeing neither approval nor condemnation, just an acknowledgement that her voice had forced a shift. For the next half hour, residents asked him direct questions, challenging the hospital's budget claims and timeline. He stood, fielding each concern with a mixture of pragmatism and veiled frustration. By the forum's end, a slender bridge between hospital leadership and community had emerged, a pledge that Dr. Donovan and the board would meet with representatives from the coalition to discuss feasibility. It was more than had been promised a week ago, but still far from a guarantee. As people filtered out, Sophie remained near the dais, collecting her folders. Dr. Donovan approached, his expression guarded. "You fought well tonight," he said, voice low. "I can't promise anything, but we'll see where this leads." A faint shimmer of relief flickered in Sophie's eyes. She nodded, choosing not to press him further. Instead, she felt Caleb step beside her, the warm solidarity of his presence dissolving her lingering tension. Together, they walked out into the chilly night, uncertain of how the hospital board would ultimately rule, but resolute in the knowledge that truth, like healing, requires both persistence and compassion. The final day of deliberations arrived with a nervous energy swirling through town. An impromptu assembly was called at the local courthouse, where the hospital board intended to reveal its stance on the expansion. Word spread quickly, and by mid-morning, the modest courthouse lawn was crowded with townspeople, some holding signs in support of local business, others anxious to see if progress would prevail. Inside the cramped hearing room, city council members sat behind a polished wood dais, while the hospital board members occupied a row of chairs to one side. Dr. Richard Donovan was front and center, eyes fixed on the podium as he waited for the council to invite him up. Caleb Mills and Sophie Donovan sat in the front row, side by side, surrounded by their coalition allies, Margaret Blake, Bobby Coleman, Larry Wilson, Mary Jenkins, and Emmett Jameson among them. A quiet tension reigned, punctuated by whispers and the rustle of paperwork. At last, the council chair called the meeting to order. "We're here to finalize the hospital expansion matter," she said. "Dr. Donovan and his board have reviewed the alternative proposals. Let's hear what they've decided." Dr. Donovan rose, surveying the crowd with a measured calm. His gaze briefly lingered on Sophie, who returned a determined stare. "Over the past weeks," he began, "the hospital board has assessed several revised development plans. We've also listened to the community's input, voices urging us to preserve Main Street shops, protect long-standing local livelihoods, and maintain the town's character. I won't deny there has been tension and disagreement along the way. Yet," he paused, inhaling, "we do believe compromise is possible." A murmur rippled through the room. Sophie felt her pulse spike. Could it be that all their efforts were about to pay off? Dr. Donovan cleared his throat. "In light of the petitions and documentation provided by Ms. Donovan," his voice wavered slightly on the name, "and Mr. Mills's coalition, the hospital board has voted to pursue a scaled-back expansion. We will renovate existing hospital structures, build upward where feasible, and reduce the sprawl of additional parking. This revised plan will spare the businesses located on Main Street, including the grocery store and the mechanic's garage." A wave of applause burst from the audience. Sophie sagged back against the seat, eyes brimming with tears of relief. Caleb exhaled a ragged breath, feeling an unaccustomed weight lift from his chest. All around, friends and neighbors hugged or shook hands. Mary Jenkins dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. Emmett thumped his cane lightly on the floor in a show of approval. "We expect there will still be challenges," Dr. Donovan continued, speaking over the excitement. "It will require additional city permits and some financial restructuring, but we're confident the hospital can still grow while honoring this community's needs." When he finished, the council members exchanged pleased looks. The chairwoman announced, "This is a victory not just for the hospital, but for the town as well. We'll proceed with finalizing the new site plans in partnership with the hospital board and the local merchants coalition." Sophie felt tears slip down her cheeks, tears she quickly brushed away as soon as the meeting adjourned. People surged forward to offer congratulations. Margaret wrapped Sophie in a hug, Bobby shook Caleb's hand, and Larry practically danced on the spot, exclaiming that his grocery store would remain exactly where it had been for generations. At one point, Dr. Donovan worked his way through the crowd. His gaze held a semblance of humility Sophie had never seen in him before. When he reached her, he gave a small nod. "Well done," he said quietly. "You fought hard and made me see possibilities I hadn't considered." After a hesitant moment, he reached out and squeezed her hand. "You truly are your own person, Sophie. I respect that." Her eyes misted again, but she simply murmured, "Thank you, Dad," unsure if more needed to be said. The conversation was brief, yet within it lay a step toward mending the rift that had grown between them. Nearby, Caleb waited, a warm smile spreading across his features. "Once, Doctor?" Donovan moved on. Caleb pulled Sophie into a quick, joyous embrace. "We did it," he whispered against her hair, his voice thick with emotion. Sophie laughed through fresh tears. "We did, and it feels amazing." Outside the courthouse, The bright midday sun bathed the gathered townsfolk in celebratory light. Someone began playing music from a portable speaker, and the atmosphere turned almost festive. Caleb shook hands with half a dozen people who thanked him for standing up for the community. Sophie found herself receiving hugs from grateful locals who admired her courage in challenging her father. Though there would still be formalities, updated blueprints to draft, and new contracts to sign, the core battle was won. The hospital expansion would move forward in a way that respected both progress and tradition. And in that moment, a swirl of congratulatory voices, grateful faces, and the sweet rush of success, Sophie and Caleb tasted their long-sought victory. Amid the clamor, their eyes locked, and a silent understanding passed between them. Not only had they changed the hospital's future, they had also carved a path for their own. Whatever came next, they were ready to face it together. Life in the small Pennsylvania town settled back into a more familiar rhythm following the final decision on the hospital's revised expansion plan. The celebratory glow from that courthouse victory still lingered, but day-to-day responsibilities called everyone back. Shops reopened with their usual hours, construction updates at the hospital took shape more modestly, and the air carried an undercurrent of relief. Caleb Mills felt an unexpected lightness each morning when he unlocked his garage. Despite a busy schedule of repairs, he no longer feared that every oil change or tune-up might be his last day on Main Street. With the hospital's expansion scaled back, his little shop was safe for the foreseeable future. On one particularly bright morning, he stepped outside to greet a customer and couldn't help but smile at the lively hum of neighbors passing by, everything looking remarkably normal again. Word of the town's determined stand had spread across the region, prompting a few journalists to swing by, hoping to interview the mechanic who stood up to big business. Caleb, always modest, played down his own role. He insisted the entire community had made it happen, especially Sophie Donovan. The memory of her voice, steady at the microphone, still brought a quiet sense of pride. Meanwhile, Sophie settled back into her hospital shifts, a subtle change evident in the atmosphere. Staff members, particularly the nurses, treated her with heightened respect, having seen how fiercely she championed both healthcare and the community. Even her father had softened around her at work. While he maintained a rigorous pace of administrative tasks, he acknowledged her contributions by involving her in occasional planning sessions for the new hospital wing. One late afternoon, as Sophie finished her rounds, Margaret Blake intercepted her in the hallway. "You've been so busy we haven't had a proper chat," Margaret said, giving Sophie a warm, knowing look. "How does it feel now that the worst part is over?" Sophie released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "Strange," she admitted, a faint grin tugging her lips. "I can finally breathe again. No more late-night planning meetings, no more wondering if everything will fall apart, but at the same time, I'm almost missing that sense of urgency. We poured so much energy into it." Margaret chuckled lightly. "Yes, fighting for something bigger than yourself can be addictive in its own way. But you've still got plenty to do, dear, including continuing your work here, plus that personal life you've been putting on hold." Heat rose to Sophie's cheeks. Though she smiled, she knew exactly what Margaret meant. Between saving the town and long hospital shifts, she and Caleb had shared precious few quiet moments. A quick hug here, a late-night phone call there. Now maybe they had a chance to explore whatever lay between them without looming threats overshadowing every conversation. Later that evening, Sophie parked her car near the garage. The sun dipped low, casting the street in gentle gold. She found Caleb inside, humming softly to the radio while he inspected a pickup's engine. Grease stained the back of his hand, and the collar of his work shirt was smudged with oil. But to her, he'd never looked more at ease. He glanced up, breaking into a broad grin. "Hey, stranger," he teased, wiping his hands on a rag. "Come to offer me a post-expansion victory dinner, maybe?" She let out a small laugh, stepping closer. "I'd say you deserve it. I also wanted to see if tomorrow night, after your shop closes, we might do something fun, like normal people who aren't fighting a massive political battle." Caleb feigned a thoughtful expression. "Normal people? Don't know if I qualify, but I'm open to suggestions." They settled on grabbing dinner at a cozy diner on the edge of town, a place known for homemade meatloaf and pecan pie. Sophie's spirits soared at the prospect of a simple evening, just the two of them, free from deadlines and group strategy meetings. The fleeting touches of his hand, the warmth in his eyes whenever they met. Those had been her quiet source of strength during the hardest nights of the expansion debate. Before Sophie left, Caleb gently brushed a stray hair from her forehead. "I'm glad you came by," he said softly. "We're both usually good at taking care of everyone else. Now it's time we look after ourselves too." She nodded, warmth blooming in her chest. Outside, streetlights flickered on, illuminating a main street that felt both comfortingly familiar and subtly renewed. The garage's neon sign hummed overhead, a reassuring presence that signaled home, perseverance, and the promise of a more settled future. As Sophie headed to her car, her footsteps felt lighter, each step carrying her into a life that was, at long last, hers to define, both in her work at the hospital and in the uncharted path unfolding with Caleb. As early autumn deepened, the town's trees turned brilliant shades of orange and red. Sunshine continued to illuminate Main Street, where the familiar shops thrived without the cloud of looming demolition overhead. For Sophie Donovan and Caleb Mills, life moved in a calmer, though not entirely predictable, rhythm. One sunny morning, Sophie slipped out of her tiny rental house, tucking a light scarf around her neck. She inhaled the crisp air, recalling that less than a month ago she'd been sprinting from one tense meeting to another. Now, her morning routine involved a peaceful walk to the hospital, her choice motivated by a newfound appreciation for the town's tranquility. Along the way, she greeted neighbors like Mary Jenkins, who opened her bakery early. The smell of fresh cinnamon rolls wafted out onto the sidewalk, prompting Sophie to promise she'd stop by later. Caleb, meanwhile, discovered a similar shift in his routine. Instead of waking up burdened by anxiety over the hospital's plans, he eagerly checked the day's repair schedule. With local farmers bringing in harvest equipment and families prepping for holiday travel, the garage kept him busy in a satisfying way. He'd hired a part-time helper, Bobby's nephew, a 19-year-old eager to learn the trade, giving Caleb more freedom to manage the business instead of handling every repair himself. On Wednesday afternoon, Sophie finished her hospital shift earlier than usual and decided to surprise Caleb. She found him polishing the newly painted exterior of the garage, a project he'd tackled to restore its original charm. "Looks nice," she said, stepping closer to admire the fresh coat of navy blue paint. "Where'd you get the idea to spruce it up?" He shrugged with a playful grin. "After all that drama, I figured the shop deserved a little TLC. Maybe show the town we're here to stay." They chatted for a few minutes, talking about nothing in particular, just enjoying each other's company. Then Sophie asked, "Any plans tonight?" Caleb shook his head. "Not really. I was thinking of heading home to cook, maybe watch a football game. Why, got something in mind?" She hesitated, then plunged ahead. "I've been thinking about starting a small community workshop, teaching basic first aid, healthy lifestyle tips, that kind of thing. I'd also love to incorporate a segment on car safety, like what to do if your car overheats in the middle of nowhere." A twinkle lit her eyes. "I was thinking maybe we could lead it together." His face lit up, interest peaked. "You mean, Like a monthly session for folks? I'd be in... Actually, that sounds really good. They spent the next hour discussing details, potential venues, material costs, ways to make it fun yet informative. The conversation flowed easily. Sophie's knowledge of health blended naturally with Caleb's practical mechanical advice. Together, they realized they could offer a holistic approach to everyday life challenges. Whether someone needed to check blood pressure or jumpstart a stalled vehicle. Later that evening, they hopped into Caleb's pickup and drove to a quiet diner on the outskirts of town, the same one they'd promised to try for a proper meal. Rustic decor, neon signs, and the mouth-watering aroma of grilled burgers greeted them at the door. Over plates of classic American comfort food, fried chicken for Sophie, a loaded cheeseburger for Caleb, they continued brainstorming ideas for the workshop series. The conversation drifted toward deeper waters as the meal wore on. Caleb admitted he'd once considered leaving town for bigger opportunities, especially when business had been slow. "I guess I worried I wasn't living up to my full potential," he explained, eyes on his fries. "But now I see potential can be found anywhere if you're doing what you love." Sophie reached across the small table, resting her hand lightly on his. "I get that. For years, I kept chasing my father's approval, assuming I needed his name or his resources to prove my worth. But here, working alongside you and this community, I've never felt so grounded or so sure I'm exactly where I should be." They lingered at the diner long after finishing dessert, sipping coffee and relishing the unhurried pace of an evening spent in each other's company. Outside, the dark sky gleamed with stars, untainted by city lights. By the time Caleb drove Sophie back to her house, both felt the contentment of a new routine settling in, one where crisis had given way to collaboration and quiet moments replaced frantic tension. As he walked her to the door, a gentle breeze carried the scent of fallen leaves, symbolic of change, yet also of continuity. Sophie turned to Caleb, a soft smile curving her lips. "I like this," she whispered, "just us living our lives without a ticking clock or a looming threat." He slipped an arm around her waist, pulling her closer for a brief, warm hug. "Me too," he said quietly. "I think we've earned it." A few weeks after the town's victory, Sophie and Caleb's idea for a community workshop took shape in a modest but well-lit assembly hall near the public library. Word spread quickly. Margaret Blake posted flyers in the hospital break room, Bobby Coleman taped them to bulletin boards at the grocery store, and Mary Jenkins slipped announcements into every bakery bag. By the workshop's debut evening, the hall was buzzing with curious residents, from teenagers to retirees. Sophie stood near the front of the room in a casual sweater and jeans, her nerves dancing with excitement. This was different from her usual role at the hospital. Here, she was an educator, set to share insights about basic first aid and preventative care. She spotted Margaret in the front row, offering a supportive grin, and Dr. Donovan himself standing discreetly at the back. He had said little about this venture, but his presence tonight felt like a quiet endorsement. Caleb fussed with a small table displaying car maintenance items, jumper cables, a tire gauge, and various tools. His easygoing confidence surfaced as he greeted neighbors. "Hey, Sam," he called to a farmer in the second row. "You bring that tractor by any time. It's still making that rattling noise." Laughter and friendly banter broke the initial formality, setting an upbeat tone. At 7 o'clock sharp, Sophie took the microphone. "Thank you all for coming. This workshop is about simple ways to stay healthy, both in terms of your body and your car." A few chuckles rippled through the crowd. "We'll talk about what to keep in a basic medical kit at home, how to handle small emergencies like burns or cuts, and Caleb will show us how to do routine car checks so we're not stranded on the roadside." For the next half hour, Sophie demonstrated how to use a blood pressure cuff, what items should be in a first aid kit, and the early signs of conditions like dehydration or low blood sugar. She spoke with warmth, peppering in anecdotes from her nursing shifts to illustrate real-life scenarios. Occasionally, she glanced at Dr. Donovan, who offered a subtle nod of approval each time she emphasized preventive care. That gesture, small as it was, made Sophie's heart glow. Then Caleb stepped up, walking the audience through car maintenance basics. He explained how often to check fluids, when tires typically needed replacing, and the value of keeping jumper cables or a portable battery charger in the trunk. The crowd listened intently, especially when he described the day Sophie's car overheated on the side of the road, the very encounter that sparked their entire journey together. A few people in the audience who remembered that stormy morning laughed along with his recounting of the downpour, teasing about Sophie's frantic expression and Caleb's soggy, grease-stained jacket. To conclude, they led a Q&A where residents asked everything from, "What's the best way to treat a bad cut on the farm?" to "How do I handle a sputtering engine halfway to the next town?" Sophie and Caleb took turns answering, sometimes bouncing off each other's explanations. The synergy between them was palpable, a delightful mixture of earnest expertise and genuine camaraderie. When the workshop ended, applause and gratitude filled the room. People lingered to chat, shake hands, and request future sessions on more specialized topics. Margaret gave Sophie a proud hug. "I can't believe how well that went," she gushed. "You two are a perfect team." Sophie and Caleb exchanged a warm glance, both recalling how improbable this partnership had seemed not so long ago. As the last of the attendees drifted out, Dr. Donovan approached, hands in his pockets. "You've done well here," he remarked, gaze flicking between them. "This workshop isn't just a benefit to the community, but it also embodies what I hope the hospital can become, truly engaged with the people it serves." Sophie felt her throat tighten. For years, she'd longed for her father's validation, and while they still differed on many things, this moment hinted at a shifting dynamic between them. "Thank you, Dad," she said quietly. "We'll keep building on it, maybe do monthly sessions with different themes." He offered a small, genuine smile before turning to Caleb. "And thank you for all your help. I may not have said it before, but you've shown me that progress can't just roll over those who've built this town from the ground up." Caleb nodded politely, maintaining a respectful tone. "We're all in this together. And I'm grateful for your support, too." In the stillness that followed, Sophie realized they'd reached another milestone. Not only had they protected the town, but they were now guiding it towards something new, a fusion of healthcare, practical life skills, and neighborly concern. It wasn't grandiose or high-profile, yet the impact felt tangible. They packed up their props and handouts, buoyed by the success of the evening. Outside, a light breeze rustled the trees, carrying faint echoes of the applause that had filled the hall. Together, Sophie and Caleb reflected on how far they'd come, from a fraught roadside encounter in the rain to leading a community workshop side by side. And in that soft swirl of autumn air, it felt as though they'd only just begun discovering what more they could accomplish. Hand in hand. A gentle hush enveloped the late autumn evening, with amber streetlights illuminating the rows of quaint buildings along Main Street. In front of the newly painted garage, Caleb Mills leaned against his pickup, quietly watching as Sophie Donovan locked up her car. The crisp air carried a mild chill, signaling winter's approach, yet there was warmth in the way they smiled at each other as she strolled over. "That workshop was a success," Sophie remarked, recalling the enthusiastic turnout earlier that day. "I was half afraid people would be too busy or uninterested in basic first aid, but it seems like we're helping address real concerns." Caleb agreed, stepping forward to slip an arm around her shoulders. "Folks trust you," he said softly, "and I think they trust me too, at least when it comes to their cars. His grin turned playful. We're kind of a two-for-one deal at this point. They shared a brief laugh, and Sophie gazed at the softly lit storefronts up and down Main Street. A few months ago, she would have driven past them without a second thought, just another random stop on life's journey. Now, every facade, every quirky shop sign, felt like part of her own story. She took a slow breath, inhaling the faint scent of a distant fireplace. Remember that day in the pouring rain? She mused, voice quiet with reminiscence. I was so frantic about missing my first shift at the hospital, and you refused to take any payment. You just helped. Caleb nodded, recalling how unexpected it all seemed at the time. I thought I was just doing what anybody would do. Turns out it was the start of everything changing, for both of us. He brushed a light kiss across her temple. I never expected to find meaning beyond fixing engines and rotating tires. Now, somehow, I'm part of this bigger effort to help the community, thanks to you. Sophie's gaze flicked toward the horizon, where the last vestiges of twilight lingered. I used to think I needed distance from my father's world, his name, his hospital, if I wanted to prove my worth. But after all that's happened, I've realized there's a middle ground. I can stand beside him while still standing up for what I believe in. Her eyes softened as she turned back to Caleb. And I can build something real with you right here, in a town I never expected to call home. They meandered down the sidewalk, arms comfortably linked, passing the bakery, closed for the night, and the small convenience store that remained open for late shoppers. Overhead, the star-speckled sky offered a serene canopy, a reminder of the vast world that extended far beyond this tiny slice of Pennsylvania. Yet the allure of faraway places didn't tug at Sophie or Caleb the way it once might have. They had roots here now, roots nurtured by trials, triumphs, and genuine care for the people around them. Pausing by a quiet corner near the park, they found a bench overlooking a darkened pond. Caleb sat, gently guiding Sophie next to him. The reflection of the moon shimmered across the still water. For a moment, neither spoke, content to absorb the tranquility that was becoming their new normal. At length, Sophie rested her head on Caleb's shoulder. "We've come a long way," she murmured, voice thick with an emotion she didn't bother to hide. "There were times I thought everything, my job, my father's respect, your garage, this whole town, was on the brink of collapse." Caleb's hand found hers, lacing their fingers together. "It's still not perfect," he admitted, "but it's ours. And I think we proved that people who genuinely care can shape a better outcome, no matter their background or status." She nestled closer. "What do you see for our future?" The question lingered in the cool night air. He exhaled thoughtfully. "More of this, I hope. More workshops, more small steps that strengthen the place we live. And as for you and me, well, I see a lot of shared sunsets. Perhaps a home of our own someday." His voice quivered with soft honesty. "As far as I'm concerned, you're welcome in my world, permanently." A tender silence wrapped around them. They hadn't spoken openly about marriage or a formal commitment yet, but the implication glowed in the spaces between their words. Sophie pressed her cheek against his shoulder, heart brimming. "I want that, too," she whispered. Somewhere in the distance, a train horn echoed, a reminder that beyond the boundaries of this close-knit community lay countless possibilities. Yet for now, the future felt beautifully anchored right here, side by side on a small-town bench beneath a midnight sky. This horizon, both literal and metaphorical, stretched wide with promise, a promise forged from a humble act of kindness on a rainy roadside, sustained by unwavering resolve, and deepened by a love that had proven itself resilient through every storm. I hope you enjoyed today's story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more stories like this. Leave a like and comment below what you thought of the story. See you in the next video.